the main themes of the topics we'll be discussing on our panel discussion. Let me give you a little brief of what we'll be talking about. Colonization settled into the institutions that govern Western African life, or African life in general, shaping how power is held, how wealth moves, and how cultural life survive in position. This panel will be discussing how the structure we have inherited, and we ask who were they built for, who they continue to serve, and what it would take to build differently. So, the first question, who is yours? Should we go to the interest?
No, I think that way.
Okay. So the first question is to Sigile. Are there any underlying colonial roots that are founded within the current political climate or structure?
Yes. I think the answer is yes. I think the state itself, we need to understand that it's an invention of European interests in Africa. You want me to speak? Okay, the state itself, you must understand that it's something that was crafted by the colonizers to secure their interests in the continent. And alongside that, it also extended to traditional institutions that were found in the continent. So I think when it comes to traditional leadership, we should not assume that it has not been permeated by colonial psyche itself. We understand that some leaders who were resisting this colonial expansion, their heads are kept in some museums in Europe, and those that were agreeable to the colonial project are the ones we call king and chief today. So I think the colonialism, we need to also understand that it exists even in what we call our traditional systems. You see, we can see what is happening. The tribal rhetoric, that comes because speaking as a South African, I want to make it a point that we have retained coloniality here to a level of a constitution. During apartheid, there were reserves that were created for black communities. If you are Xhosa, you will stay in the Transkei and the Ciskei. If you are Zulu, there will be Zululand. If you are Ndebele, there will be Kwangwane. You are Tswana, there will be Tswana, like that, right? So that there are territories that are marked for particular communities. You see, what we have done in '94 is to upgrade that system by having 9 provinces. The Eastern Cape for the Xhosas, KZN for the Zulus, Free State Sothos, Western Cape Coloured, like that. You see, like that. Hence you find that some people here who find themselves in parliament, which it means a travesty of Mr. Lucas, have been calling for people who are Xhosa speaking to leave the Western Cape because they are blocking the delivery of services to particular communities. You see? So I want us to understand that this is a colonial architecture that has been cemented by a democratic constitution. That is why in South Africa it becomes default to, we just slip into divisions blindly. You see? Because there are particular areas that certain communities must see themselves as home and others not. The second level of coloniality is about the city itself. The city, black people in the city are only recognized as their status as people who come to sell labor, not to be permanent residents who have rights that can be transferred to their children. You see, you must only come and work I'm sure some of you have seen that the Cape Town is half empty in December. You see? Because there is that mentality that we do not belong here. Where we belong is in those homelands. So I just want us to understand that this is an architecture of coloniality, even within this current system that is praised so much outside there. And it is the one that is driving this mentality of seeing one another as outsiders. No, my voice is fine. So, comrades, I think this needs to be understood. You know, that in the city, if you are not white, you are temporary. You must look at how your house is built. It is not built for a family that will grow. It's built like a dormitory. That you must come, sleep, go to work, come, sleep, go to work. You see, how our settlements, I want us to look, to read the territory in which we live and see that there is this enduring coloniality with it. Because this is something that started centuries ago and it is still in effect today. You know. So I think the state is really, really colonial. Because you must understand that in South Africa, all this noise about freedom and all these things, like I meant what I said, that there's a difference between freeing a country and freeing people. You see, when you free a country, a small elite is going to rise to the top. You know, not people. So I want us to understand this thing that we inherited a state that had a particular way of looking at particular classes. You see. So this is not something that I would say it is a mistake to conclude so that I can allow others to speak. The people that are in government, that are in big companies, you know, captains of industry and all of that, they engage in looting the state, in shortchanging the people, knowing very well that some of the victims of my actions are going to be my relatives. You see? Are going to be my relatives. I will take this tender and then there's no water in that community. I don't care if I have relatives there. So I think this is also the colonial psyche within our systems, that we become titles and not become people when we're given power. You know, we stop being people. We become titles. So I think for me that's a long way of saying we definitely have decolonization. Still has a long way, still a long battle to fight, and fighting it we must.
Alright, so for this question is yours. Who is the immigration system in the global perspective designed to benefit?
Yeah, it's a very tough question. Because this presents and represents the protection of the lives of the people. Like I indicated when I started with my colleague here, the way he has actually narrated the whole historical background of where we are coming from. If we have to talk about migration systems, and I doubt if in African context we even have a definition of a migration. In our own language. In our own language, instead of defining migration or have a term that directly translates to migration, we explain what is a migration. And I doubt even here, amongst ourselves, there is one person who can tell me with a single word that can match migration. Unfortunately, we don't have such words. Then it links very well in a situation where my colleague has indicated that the colonization comes from far because we adopted the terms that does not fit very well within our context. And when I talk about context, I'm talking about our everyday lives that we face in our daily basis, in our daily struggles. I will take you back so that you can understand how the African continent came to actually submit itself to the international structures, which was designed to actually control the movement of people within their own territory, not just in the country or in the world, in their own territory. When I talk about a territory, we're talking about the continent, the countries, and whatsoever. And we also have borders that were actually created by the previous history, which was very much suppressive to our black community. If you look at the 1951 conventions coming to the systems, we have got the 1951 conventions on the status relating to the refugees. And that tells you in terms of when that convention was actually established and designed and adopted by the United Nations, it provided individual states with the capabilities and the powers to say, actually, when you are going to be dealing with issues of migration, follow these processes. Actually, people were defined from the global level, and when they were defined from the global level, there was no proper definition that was actually introduced to actually fit each and every individual, especially from the African continent. Because when you look at the definition of a refugee, it was imposed. And there was a perception that forever be, in other poor and other developing countries, there will always be war. That's why if you look at the definition of who is a refugee, it strongly emphasizes persecution and war as something that we have been subjected to. To say, yeah, people will run away from war. And who will be inflicting or inciting war? That's another debate that we need to be actually heavy in our next discussions. And then when you look at how the 1951 conventions was actually adopted in different countries, countries looked at the model that will actually say, how can I make it work for our countries? And we had the AU. By then it was still called Organization of African Unity, AOU. They also produced or developed or drafted the other conventions. And they always say to protect their African refugee problems. So that's how now I'm trying to paint a picture and looking at how the system was designed. If you look at the AOU conventions on the refugees, they didn't say protections, they say addressing the refugee problems. How do you design a system where already having a perception of problems? And I still today contest that narratives and that neurology that they have put behind the AOU, because the AOU convention is the one that many African countries they have actually adopted or used to actually develop their own national policies. And when we talk about national policies, I'm talking about different migration policies that individual African countries they have actually adopted. Coming to South Africa, because of course the social cohesion that we are trying to build is within the South African borders. So the South African adopted both the 1951, the 1967, and the 1969. The 1969 is the AOU conventions. And when they looked at those three models or those international systems or structures, they then realized that we need to come up with a law that will actually manage migration or forced migrants in our country. I always use our country, not South Africa. I always use our country, if you have to follow my conversation. And then during the apartheid regime, I'm just trying to paint you a picture to see that where are we going with the system. During the apartheid regime, before 1994, South Africa was using what we used to call an Aliens Act to manage migration. And some of us sitting here, we get to understand what is an alien when the TV and other social media became fashionable. We started seeing things that we don't understand on TV. They look like humans, but they're not humans. And that Aliens Act you can tell that the definition of who is a migrant in that law, it was someone who's not known, someone who does not exist, and someone who was not wanted. If you go deeper in reading, they repealed the Aliens Act that was used during the apartheid regime to control migration. And that Aliens Act was not only used, as my colleague has indicated, was not only used for the non-national, it was also used to the very same nationals within South Africa. That is where now the pass law came in. If you had to move from Pakistan, Botswana, Palawura, and so forth, you will use to have the pass law. And the definitions of who is a migrant within the Aliens Act, it was so much subjective, in a sense that it created a system where we started looking at each other based on the tribal belonging. We started looking at, I am a Muvenda, so I need to protect the Venda nation. I am a Muslim, I need to protect the Muslim nation. I'm Hindu, I need to protect. So that created again, as we are sitting here. And then we grew up and we progressed knowing that as much as we are all living in the same country, we are not the same. You will remain who you are, I will remain who I am. And then post apartheid regime in 1994, because now we're transitioning to the democratic space now. And democracy is a big word to use. If you don't understand it, it can be very much dangerous concept to live with in your pocket, in your daily life. Then the government of South Africa realized that the Aliens Act was not aligning with the democratic principles and the constitutional value of our country. They then repealed the Aliens Act. And when they repealed the Aliens Act, they introduced what we call, they came up with two laws to separate the two, because Aliens Act was clustering the forced migrants and the voluntary migrants that we normally call economic migrants. And then in 1998, this is the journey I'm trying to paint. In 1998, the South African government, after the constitution was passed and adopted, they established one law that is called a Refugee Act of 1998. It's Act number 38. You must take time and just go and read. And when the Refugee Act was enacted to be the law that governs the forced migrants or refugees and asylum seekers, if you look at its definition, nothing changed. It clearly copied what the 1951 Convention and the OAU Convention defined a refugee. Not considering the obstacles, the presenting challenges, and the African necessity when it comes to the movement of people in Africa and how Africa should be developed and be built. It also emphasized the issue of war, persecution, belonging to a particular social group. Why am I saying belonging to a particular social group? You will remember that I indicated that as Muvenda, I will remain Muvenda, I will have to protect my own space. So that particular social group was re-emphasized within the Refugee Act of 1998 to make sure that even though we are fighting to liberate Africa, you should always remember that you don't belong to the Zulu nation, you don't belong to Xhosa nation, you don't belong to Botswana, you don't belong to Botswana. You still belong to your particular social group. Rather be religiously, rather be faith, rather be tribal, rather be sexual orientation. So they re-emphasized that. But the Refugee Act came with some progressive prospect to say, when you are in South Africa, you will enjoy almost all the rights as South African, as long as your status has been adjudicated. Then the system were now established to say, when you are coming, you need to apply for an asylum seeker, you need to put down your claim, and you need to state why you are actually fleeing from your home country, and then the Department of Home Affairs will then investigate your claim, and if they see it fit for you to receive a refugee status, they will definitely adjudicate, and if they don't see it fit, they will then reject. So now the system was established, which we are living with now. And when they divide the two systems, they already, I don't know whether they already foresee the challenges. They also came out, because the Refugee Act was only catering for the forced migrants. They also, in 2002, realized that the Refugee Act does not cover other particular groups of people that we live within the South African borders. They then introduced what we call Immigration Act. And in that Immigration Act of 2002, they were actually introducing it to actually say, how do we then best manage the economic migrants, those who are voluntarily fleeing their country to seek better life in other countries, including South Africa. And as it stands now, the two pieces of legislation, they hardly speak to each other as one of the systems. Why am I saying that? Economic migrants, the Immigration Act that governs the economic migrants, it then extends its operation into the Refugee Act. Because if you are found with the refugee status that has expired, you are dealt with under the Immigration Act. You are not dealt with under the Refugee Act for the issue of arrest, detention, and deportation. So those are some of the systems. And when this system was designed, definitely you can tell that we have it. So currently those are the systems that I can say they were designed to actually control the Africans that we live with, in terms of to control their movement and to actually limit their liberty, because sometimes we are seen as the threat to development. Let me pause it there for now.
So Sarah, how are we going to utilize how we were prior to being labeled, colonized? How we were labeled as colonized people, to be where we are now, to have a fruitful future, like as a continent.
Thank you so much for the question. So I feel like in order to answer this question, we need to tap a little bit into history. So I do want to talk about it in kind of like 3 stages, right? So you have pre-colonization, pre-Berlin Conference. You have colonization, and you have after colonization, right? So pre-colonization, we have the transatlantic slave trade, right? Which I'm sure you guys have heard of, where they were basically, where Europeans were trading with coastal African territories and pushing slavery and stuff like that to the Americas, right? So you have that happening from about the 1400s to like the 1800s, okay? And so then after that, in the early 1880s, you have King Leopold. Are you guys familiar with King Leopold? Yes. So you have King Leopold from Belgium that was very, at the time, in search of greed and more wealth for himself and Belgium. So he goes to DRC, and you have him where he starts to colonize and stuff like that. Then you have a bunch of other European countries that also kind of join in, because it's kind of like the more expansion you have of your country, the higher place you have in the realm of geopolitical sense, if that makes sense. So you have that, and then it was a little bit disorganized, so what they did was they had this thing called the Berlin Conference, right? So then they all kind of sat together in Berlin, and they were like, okay, they kind of sat down, they had Africa basically be like a cake at the table, and they started cutting up the cake, as far as which territories and colonies these European countries would have. So the problem with the Berlin Conference is that it was only one-sided. There was one key player that was not involved, which was Africa, right? So, we can't assume that it was in our best interest if we weren't even invited to the discussion. That's the first thing. So yeah, as it divided up the continent, right? I told you this was happening in the 1880s, right? So from about 1884, when the Berlin Conference happened, to about 1914, you have the European countries going from owning and controlling about 10% of the continent, which is it's the coastal regions that I was talking about, to 90% in 30 years. which is crazy. So it's really, really, really crazy. So yeah, that goes on to happen. And what happens is, in that conference, they were not, like, intentionally splitting up the continent. You see, you know how with a bunch of different countries, you see where there's a bunch of different tribes found within different countries. The same tribe, you know, that you find within many different countries is because they weren't taking into account where kingdoms, empires, and tribes were at the time of the conference, which formed a bit of a foundation of instability within our current strive for like greatness within the continent. So the goal, I want to take you into colonization, right? So the goal of colonization was to increase geopolitical stability. And for those that don't know, it's basically where you stand as a country in comparison to the other countries in the world, okay? So it's that. They also wanted to benefit their economies and strengthen their economies at the expense of exploitation, exploiting resources, expanding territories, and also like dominating those places politically to make sure that it favors the Western viewpoint. Okay, so as geopolitical expansion went up, you find there to be more of a reliance on Western powers and stuff like that, because if the country's doing well, generally within the world, then you're going to see that you want to be like them, right? But you have to see the foundations and to what extent they took to get to where they were, okay? So yeah, and that's like the realm of colonization. So the last stage would be after colonization. What happened? What happened was, you see a case where in the 1950s and 60s and so on, we find that a lot of these African colonies started gaining independence, right? So they're gaining independence, but there seems to be a problem where, because they were dependent on these Western countries for years, and not just years actually, rather centuries. So it's kind of, the question that I want to ask, and I want you guys to think about, is how do you become independent after depending on people for centuries? And what time frame do you see that being, put into place? So yeah, as the independence happened, you have this thing called, it's actually a thing in international law, called ut possidetis, which comes into play. So basically, once these colonies, right, were liberated and became independent, it was under one condition. And that condition was that these colonies that were carved at the Berlin Conference that I was talking about remain in their borders, right? So that's why the countries that, the colonies rather, that were formed at the Berlin Conference have the same structure as the countries that we live in today, right? So yes, that goes into play, and it also was to their benefit as well, because it's very convenient that, it easily allows for the rest to maintain control, because it's what they're already doing. We're using their plot, kind of thing. So, to answer the question, the way how we were prior to Western and external influence was, obviously, we saw ourselves as who we were, and we were investing in ourselves. Somewhere along the way, we lost that, right? We lost that because now we're trying to be like so-and-so, or the West, or better countries that are doing better for themselves, right? So, there's no way that you can complain that your grass is not alive if you're watering someone else's. And the key point is to water your own grass. I feel like what we need to do as Africans and diasporas, because now we've reached a time where there's a lot of people in the diaspora, and there's a lot of people that are in the diaspora that also want to help out the continent. So what we need to do is we need to water our own grass. We need to reinvest in the continent. We need to bring back our identity prior to Western influence, is what I believe. And the way that we can do this is first believing that it's even possible. There's a lot of Africans and a lot of diasporas and a lot of people in general, due to propaganda and many other things, don't believe that it's possible, right? So what we need to do as individuals and as Africans and diasporans is we need to first believe that it's possible and that we're capable, right? It comes from belief in oneself. Because if you don't believe that you can do it, who else is going to do it? Is the West going to do it? Is the East going to do it? At one point, they believed in themselves, right? So that's something that we also need to do as a people. We need to believe it in our bones. And that's the first step. The second step is knowing the potential knowing the potential of the continent if we give it the attention that it needs, right? And the third step is to invest. Now, when I say invest, it does not only mean financially, right? You guys merely being here is an investment into the continent because we are creating we're creating space to be able to talk about these issues and to be able to actually move forward towards solutions. So I want to say thank you first and foremost for you guys being here because you guys, believe it or not, are a part of the change and are a part of the discussion. But yes, thank you so much for the question.
There is something I'm about to say. If you guys have any questions, you can write it down and then you can ask at the end of the panel discussion, okay? Okay, so Sirius, the next question is to you. As you know, one of the main talking points in South Africa is talking about the inequalities when it comes to wealth distribution in South Africa. Can you tell us who holds the wealth within South Africa, and then Africa as a general, and what systems have been put in place to distribute it?
Look, I think the first thing to say is that business, commercial enterprises existed before the state. We've seen us talk about state capture. No, there was business before government. You see? And it did not start in 1652. The Khoi communities have been trading for centuries, servicing the ships that were passing here with water, fresh meat, and vegetables. The settlement in 1652 was a project to kill that economy and actually steal it from the Khoi. And then to build a castle to fortify their army to do that. Here by the Lisbon River, first records of private property were there when colonialists, people, the lowlifes from Europe, were given a chance whether you go and hang and be executed or take your chances in the colonies. So the people that came here were not the model citizens. Let's understand that. They were thugs, you see, who rehabilitated by the benefits that they got here. You see. The state came to protect that project later. So let's understand that business has a longer history than government here in South Africa. And I believe elsewhere as well, because even governments were getting instructions from something called the OC, Dutch East India Company. Governments in Europe were actually taking instructions from the company. So I'm saying this so that we can understand that wealth in South Africa lies in private hands. Wealth in South Africa lies with a few families, few companies. The land audit that was done in 2018, it showed that the 50 plus million people who are black, by black I mean, I come from the Black Consciousness Movement, so don't feel offended or feel excluded. As long as you're not white, I mean you. I mean you see. Look, the audit says now 50 plus million, the ownership of land is 4%. You see, it is a staggering figure. 4%. And then the ratio of wealth in South Africa reflects the ratio of wealth in the world. When you get the 10%, only 90% of the resources. You see? And what you also need to understand is that the story of wealth capitalism is not complete without mentioning South Africa. So South Africa is a country of huge interest to multinational corporations housed in the metropoles in the north. You see? And okay. I want to say this, that you see, it becomes a shame. It's quite shameful when we go out there and chase our own brothers and sisters saying, go to our country. We don't have a country.
Absolutely.
We do not have a country. You see, this country is owned by global capital.
Yes.
Global capital is the puppeteer of political parties that go to capital. You see, you can say, we know we belong to political parties, so do I. But we understand that in the game of election, the will of the people is never part of the equation. You see, it is the founder of the political party that will buy a particular policy. The policy for us to buy water, the policy for us to buy land, to buy healthcare, to buy those basics that are supposed to define our dignity. Those policies have been bought by companies who want to sell us those things. So I think when it comes to the issue of wealth inequality, we need to have that understanding that the state in this one is powerless. We are voting and we're investing in an entity that cannot deliver on its own manifesto. Let's make an example. Can anyone tell me which liberation movement actually transformed its society in this continent? I know some people say, hey, those governments have failed up there, so people are coming. We are being failed daily by this one. You see, how many people die in hospital queues? How many people are not having water for long periods of time? So there is no African state that has succeeded. And this one is also not succeeding. You see? So we're in the same kind of boat. The inequality gap is growing. It is growing. The more we struggle, democracy, rights, the more inequality kind of deepens. So I think for me, to conclude, I think it is time that when we say we are building movements, when we are organizing for change, let's take the economics seriously. Let us take the economics very seriously, and not just dwell on the rights discourse, on the right rhetoric only. I am saying this, you see, in this country, the wealth is in the hands of a minority big business, and this big business is frightened. Something is frightening big business. Local traders and comrades who are trading, who come from different parts of the continent, uniting. That's what scares them. That is why this Magabawa Hambe campaign is about. It's about preventing that. Because they've built shopping malls in the townships. They've killed local businesses there. But those shopping malls have reached a dead end. We did a research a few years ago where we calculated in this small town, when government comes and gives grants, disability, old age, those grants, when we total this amount of money, it total to something between 7.4 to 8 million each month that the beneficiary is going to. And when you look at it, you'll find that about 80% of that, on the day of the grants, it goes to the big supermarkets.
Yeah.
You see? It goes to the big supermarkets. So, what does this tell you? This recent attack on spaza shops is because that monopoly is broken. You see? Because our brothers and sisters are not going to allow a family staff because they don't have cash today. They're going to extend credit. They're going to give people the food. That at the end of the month, when that grant arrives, then that person will balance the debt.
Yeah.
You see? So these guys are very pissed that they're not getting the slice they were getting. Hence, they want to kill the sector. You see? So I'm saying we need to also look at the economics that are behind this story. Because they're so used in manipulating and having all the bigger slices, to them, sharing is injustice. Thanks.
I really want to touch more on that. I've always wanted to know that there's a huge struggle between the formal economy and the informal economy. As more foreigners are in the informal economy, they're doing their businesses and everything. Yeah, the businesses are feeling threatened. Yeah, I would love to talk to you more about that. Okay, Kulu. Going back to your previous point, you were touching on how the laws in South Africa came about, especially ones governing immigration and refugees. I have two questions that are, one, two parts. The first one being, do the current laws of South Africa benefit all South Africans? If your answer is yes, can you elaborate which demographics are the current laws within South Africa made to serve and benefit?
Thank you very much. It's a very technical and very strategic question. Before I get to the question, I just wanted to extend to what my colleague has indicated. When it comes to issues of threats to big businesses, and I will relate this to what has just transpired recently. When the government of Ghana issued a call to say if there are any Ghanaians who are feeling threatened, they must come back home. The whole transportation process was facilitated, right? And I guess we are all following the news and the development. Yeah. And when the government officials and some leaders in Ghana started speaking and actually responding to the current situation that is taking place in South Africa, and when they touched and they named big businesses that are operating in Ghana that are South African owned, we all know what are those businesses that were mentioned. And then you bring it to the neurology of Abraham. The leader of the March and March changed the context. She said the government of Ghana is overreacting. Because now Ghana is putting threats on the big businesses. Yeah. And the big businesses are feeling impeached by the small businesses in South Africa. Yeah. And when those big businesses were mentioned now, the context is changing. That the government of Ghana is now overreacting. Why do they want to stop the operation of so and so in Ghana? And now she's changing her context. Because definitely, those who are in South Africa who are in big businesses, they would have reached out to her and said, hey, you are now putting our businesses in Ghana in trouble by trying to impinge small businesses in South Africa. So you see where they say, hey, you meet the sword by the sword. So there is some contextual change. So I wanted to link what you were saying to say that's a practical reality. Coming back to your question, we are currently having the laws that are actually working in South Africa. South African pieces of legislations are actually democratically designed to accommodate everyone. If you look at how the Refugee Act of 1998, it has been designed before all the changes because of pressure. The initial Refugee Act, it was very clear and very straightforward in terms of what needs to happen if someone is coming to South Africa to seek asylum or to seek protection or to seek refugee. The whole challenges that we are facing now started when the issues of amendment came in 2021, where they wanted to change the processes of how one access the asylum seeker processes. It's where now the alarm and all those other negative aspects that we are seeing in our country. We also have the Immigration Act. Initially, it was well working because those economic migrants who were coming from the SADC countries, they were able to access various forms of payments or various forms of documentation to be able to regularize their stay in the country. The whole problem started when the amendment came in. Like, for example, if you have to apply for business visa, you need to now have 5 million in your account. If you have to apply for study visa, you need to apply from back home in your country, and all those kind of mechanisms. And those regulations and those mechanisms that were put in place then subjected some of the economic migrants away from qualifying for some of those visas. That's why the government, in return, around 2010, they realized that the amendment that they have done now is actually excluding some of the economic migrants. That's why the issue of exemption payments were then introduced. When they introduced the exemption payment, I will mention the two. The Zimbabwean exemption payment and the Lesotho exemption payment was to mitigate the gap that has been identified to say we do have the Southern African countries, people who are actually wanting to come to South Africa or who are in South Africa, who falls within the gap. They don't qualify to be refugees, they don't qualify to be economic migrants, and they are here. How do we then regularize their stay so that we make them regular instead of irregular? Then those exemption payment was introduced to actually cover that gap, to show that let's make the law work to everyone. And then we also have, because you asked if they work for everyone, we also have what we call the Citizenship Act. So the Citizenship Act is the one that governs the citizens of this country. I always call them the first nationals of the country. Those are the people that were born here, people who were born and bred and married and whatever here. And then that Citizenship Act, it actually elaborates in terms of who is a citizen and who can become a citizen of South Africa by birth, by naturalization, by descent. Those are the three main forms of you becoming a South African. And all those three pieces of legislation, or all these three laws combined, they then link to the South African Constitution that talks to no one may be deprived of a citizenship. That's where now we get to be absorbed into the system of the South African law regime of saying we need to be regulated, which is okay. Each and every country, they've got their own piece of legislation or law and policies that governs the business of the day, or that governs the people who are within the republic. And when you look at other laws that were then introduced to say people when they are surviving, they need water, like you indicated. They need healthcare. They need education. They need livelihoods through employment. They need equality they need justice, they need all form of protections. Then the Bill of Rights in the Constitution, which is chapter 2, then enshrines or enlisted all the rights that people will actually benefit in order to complete their survival. That's why you see that each and every right that has been written within the Bill of Rights, it stipulates everyone. And when it stipulates everyone, it's talking about every individual person who is within the Republic of South Africa, except the first national rights or the political rights that has been reserved to the citizens. And those political rights is the right to form a political party, the right to vote, the right to politically campaign. That has been given to the first citizens of this country. But those three rights are the ones that then formulate how the government of South Africa should be developed or should be structured. And that right has been deprived for refugees, asylum seekers, and economic migrants because they were deemed not to have the authority to determine how the affairs of a particular country should be run, which is fair enough.
Fair enough.
Because even South Africans, they don't determine how the affairs of DRC should be handled, but they do intersect when they meet on the subject secretariat level to discuss the political development of each and every country within the SADC, even at the AU level. We should not forget about that. So that's why you see now, we have got all laws now. You have got the National Health Act that talks to how someone accesses healthcare services in South Africa. And that act, that law, was derived from Section 27 of the Constitution of South Africa, which says that everyone has got a right to access basic healthcare services, including the labor services, especially for women, sexual and reproductive health rights. So you could see the interlinkages between the law and the Constitution. When you speak about education as well, I think it's Section 29 that speaks to education as a mistake in the Constitution. It talks about everyone having access to basic education. And when you talk about Section 28 that speaks to children's rights, it does not discriminate in terms of what kind of children we are talking about. It talks about every child has got a right to a name and nationality. And that's the law. And when you look at the South African Children's Act that was introduced sometimes in 2014 and 2004 with its amendment, it doesn't even discriminate in terms of who is a child in need of care and protection. So the list is endless. And you can tell that those laws, they were meant to benefit each and every individual that is in this country legally. And now in South Africa, the contestation that we are actually seeing at a rising pace is that we have got a failed system, like what my colleague has indicated. We have got a failed system in the sense that when the projection of democracy was exciting each and every political leader in this country, there was no projections of the future in terms of how will the country look like in the next 20 years, in the next 30 years. We are 30 years into democracy. It's when now the government of South Africa, including other African states, starting to think of, we have children who have got future. How are they going to survive? Did we prepare them for survival for the future? So we inherited democracy without the plans for the future. So this is where now the challenges are. And we had a lot of looting, the state capture that my colleague indicated. Those prospects were not actually projected. So the enrichment went to the few and went to those who have got power. Now the people have now started the democracy in terms of what should be belonging to them. And now the conflict and confusion is at play now. People now are fighting each other for the space in the first position. There is a question that gets to be asked most of the time, that if we are running a marathon and I'm in position 1, I'm in position 2, you overtake me, what position are you? That's a very serious question. If I'm in position 2, we are running a marathon, and you overtake me from position 2, what position are you in? Some people say it's 1, and it's not 1, it's 2. you remain in the back position. The people that we need to overtake is the people in leadership. Because me and you, we are in position too. Because the state needs to service us. And we need to make sure that the state is servicing us. And we keep overtaking each other. We are not overtaking position one. We are all thinking of, if I get rid of a Canadian, if I get rid of a Zimbabwean, if I get rid of Ethiopian, if I get rid of a Somalian, if I get rid of Mozambican, or if I get rid of a South African, or if I get rid of Namibian, I will be better placed. And that's not true. For us to be better placed is to overtake the government, which is the leadership. And we don't overtake the government to take over. We overtake the government to make them listen to us and provide what is due to us as promised during the liberations. That we are going to be living in harmony, we are going to be living in a cohesive society. We are going to live in a society where peaceful coexistence is realistic. At the moment, peaceful coexistence is not existing. Because I always see my next person. If you are not belonging to my tribe, if you are not belonging to my nation, I see you as a threat. I see you being number two. That's why when we have got xenophobic attacks in our society and other related intolerance directed to non-national South Africans and the LGBTQI plus group, we always talk about, they are giving first preference to migrants. They are giving first preference to the LGBTQI plus group, and which is not true. The reason is we are always wanting to overtake number two, to be in position two, not to be in position one with the number ones. Because if we can all try to be in position number one with the number ones, I think we can get somewhere. So let me pause there for now. Thank you.
Sarah, your question is, why is it that tribal cultures within African countries are shadowed by the Western common practices within society or on a day-to-day basis?
Thank you again for that question. Also in order to answer this question, I want to reference my answer to my previous question regarding the history of Africa in relation to Europe and vice versa. So part of the reason why we have the situation where a lot of different countries and their tribes aren't as... I actually want to answer this more in a diaspora perspective. So part of the reason why there are diasporas out there that are not as, I guess I want to say confident, if confident is concerned, in their tribes, their cultures and stuff like that, is because of the century-long relationship between Europe and Africa, right? So essentially, because of that history that I had explained in my previous question, transatlantic slave trade, Berlin Conference, colonization, etc., and even independence, it's because of that, you have a sense where, like I was mentioning, Europe and the different countries within Europe are at a higher place geopolitically than these other African countries that just became independent, right? And this is partially a result of where they started, right? So it's almost as if you're running on a track. I think it's still your example. You're running on a track and you have someone that got a 10-second head start with you, or even a 20-second head start with you. In this case, a 500-year head start with you, right? From where you were. So, I'm not going to say starting a country, but if you understand me, from, say, the 1960s and 50s, when they had previously had all this experience, trial and error, where it was just them competing amongst themselves, right? And have it where they were able to get a head start. And not only as like an international perspective, it even happens in America as well, in the Americas, where you have like the white people that came from England and etc. that had a head start among the black people and stuff like that, and suppressed them to a certain level, to a certain extent. And then once the 1950s hit, you have the civil rights era. Now you have a situation where black people are now given a chance to start after they have generationally been starting for a while, right? So it's almost as if you can't compare a 22-year-old to a 1-year-old. You get me? In the same sense, even though I feel like a lot of the times we will almost, like be angry and get upset because of the way our countries are today, right? And because of like how they're not improving, they're not X, Y, Z, whatever, right? But we have to know that we were given a different start time than they were, right? We have to understand that, we have to recognize that. And because of that, like, their influence during that time when we were started was more heavily like pushed across the world. Because as they're expanding and as they're growing and gaining more territories around the world, their influence is also pushing. Their way of life is also pushing. Their day-to-day life, everything is pushing to these other countries that had not previously lived the way how they were living, right? And because of that, you have a situation where, like, I would say maybe up until maybe 2015 or so, you have a situation where like a lot of Africans found within the diaspora aren't as confident in themselves and in their tribes because of how society puts them. So yeah, and sorry guys. But yeah, so anyways, you find that situation. But fortunately, I call it the great shift. I don't know if that's really what it is, but that's what I call it. Where now you kind of find a situation where Africans in the diaspora and on the continent are now finding more pride within themselves and things like that. And now that we're living in a situation where that happened, we are now becoming more proud of our tribal cultures and becoming more proud of who we are, where we came from, etc. So we still do have a long way to go as far as that, but it's definitely a start, and I think that our confidence will come more when we begin to invest in ourselves more. Yes. Thank you for the question.
I believe that is the conclusion of our panel discussion. Do you have any final remarks you want to say before we hand over to our audience for questioning?
No, I want to maybe expand a little bit on us taking the economics seriously. I do think that we need to understand why people are risking the strong currents of the Mediterranean and are going to Europe. You know, some die at sea. Why people are leaving, their countries and go to Europe, go to the US, like that. There are many reasons for that, but I want to emphasize this one. They are following their resources. They are following their resources. Europe is what it is because of extraction from Africa. And South Africa is what it is by extracting from other countries in the region. We need to understand this. Some PE fat cats are owning mines in Zimbabwe, DRC, Central African Republic, Chad. Some PE fat cats. Some old money as well is running supermarket chains throughout the continent. You see, the stores that were there 30 years ago are no longer there. You have a shop right now, you have all these kind of things there. And these mines that they explore, that they use, they are actually displacing people. Villages disappear through mining operations. So why would we blame people that are displaced by mining, that they follow the resources of their land to where they are taking? So I think it's a dynamic we also need to take into account. That this thing of African states, that they are failing because they have poor leadership. I think this is a distortion. Every liberation movement, when it enters power, whether through the front in the war or through an election, there's already a plan to undermine it. There is already a plan to sabotage it. Firstly, this plan involves killing the radical ones among those leadership. And then the compromised ones and the fools and the greedy are the ones that are going to be retained. There's a saying in France, they ask, how much does an African president cost? You say a pair of socks. That's how cheap, our politicians are. So I want us to take these things into account. South Africans, we must understand what the businesses of this country are doing in the continent. We must understand what they are doing in the continent. Then I think we'll have a different understanding of why this push, why people are coming to seek a life of dignity here. Because what was giving them dignity in their respective countries has been destroyed by this business operation. And in all honesty, I think South Africa has enough to resolve this poverty problem. It is not called the most unequal country in the world for nothing. Because the model we are using is making sure that the ones that are rich, they must continue to get rich. The ones that are poor, they continue to. At the heart of a crisis, have you seen how busy the construction industry is? Buildings are springing up. We say the economy is bad. But the construction industry is very busy. It's offering people a 2-week job and then they go and lie and say and manipulate the statistics that we've created so many jobs. By the time the statistics is published, probably half the people are already, their contracts have expired, they are back. So the unemployment problem, I think we need to also, that's why I'm saying, let's take the economics seriously. Let's try and follow where does this money come from. Lastly, I have to say this, lastly. Here there is an accusation that is leveled against traders from the continent that they are actually poisoning the children. They are selling substandard food, they are planting drugs in our community. I think we need to go beyond the headlines, here and try to understand what the story is. You see here, there is a structure of the retail industry in this country where the food you get in the ShopRite in Rondebosch is not the same What checkers, it's not the same that you get in ShopRite, in Kylie. We are talking about a completely white-owned system here. You see? So, the fresh food must be consumed in the shadows of Table Mountain. When this food is reaching expiry, we must move it to the townships. You know? And then if the townships not getting expiry, let's go to the villages. You see? So, I think we need to understand the food system and not fall into this trap of thinking that people deliberately go and purchase food that is going to harm people's health. That is not true.
Yeah.
That is not true. We have a food system that has its own problems already. And honestly, I do not think any of my brothers and sisters actually do have the money to transport cocaine from Latin America and bring it here. I don't think so. I don't think they also have a know-how, the chemistry of combining these things and flat tick, with these things. It's just that the people who are doing this, mostly rich and white. So,
and political problems. Do you have any solutions to that? Like what our generations and all the generations can do when it comes to those types of problems we're facing? Thank you.
I'm just making a comment. First of all, I stand here as the daughter of the Great Lakes region. And therefore, I think if you were you might be my relative because many centuries ago, our people traveled from the Great Lakes region, Lake Naluvale, down to here. And that is why I say Omu tu, and you say Umu tu, and Omu, so we are together, we are one. So that is the one thing we forget. I wanted to say, and it was in response to the sister from Ghana, and maybe because of her youth, I will take that, But I wanted to say, you say that we started on the back foot and we're trying to catch up with Europe. That is part of the problem. That the European model has been presented to us as a thing we must aspire to. And we are told that we didn't have things. And our story seems to begin at colonialism. If we go back centuries, our people had incredibly powerful communities. We had Mansa Musa, the richest man in the world. We have civilizations. I grew up in East Africa. I was born in Uganda. And when I was growing up in school, I call myself a born free because I was born around the time we got independence. But when we were in school, you spoke about we're not proud of our cultures because we started on the back foot. No. When we were growing up, we were not allowed to speak our home languages in school. You got beaten. You got punished. You were told that your people had no knowledge. You had to learn the white man's knowledge. You even had to change your name. So people call me Philippa, but my other name is Yamti. And the only one thing I can say that is good about apartheid is you guys grew up speaking your own languages. You know your culture. That it was separate and you were kept separate. But I have my friend Tosi in Joburg and she'll tell me, we grew up in Soweto and I spoke Tswana, and next door to me was someone speaking Shivenda, and next door was someone speaking Xhosa, and someone speaking Setswana, and we learned each other's languages. And that is how African people are. My great-grandfather he was part of the Kingdom of Uganda, and he was in charge of the Navy. Yes, we had a Navy in Uganda of canoes that crossed Lake Naluvale, Lake Victoria, the largest lake in Africa, which is like a sea. And he traveled across through Tanzania or through Kenya, and he went to Zanzibar, and the king would send him to the king of Zanzibar to talk, and he would go there, and then he would come back. We traded with Arabs, we traded with Indians. All of these things African people did. So let us first start by knowing who we are and where we come from. Let us start by knowing that we had incredible cultures, and we have knowledge, and we have wisdom. But we were told to throw it out of the window and take somebody else's wisdom. And maybe part of it is we claim what we can, but we also remember who we are. Because when we remember who we are, then we can begin to build. I think that's part of what you're saying. And it's complicated because you have to situate it in laws. Our laws are built on Western laws. And the colonialists tell us, they taught us democracy, but let's understand this. They did not teach us democracy. Because they ruled us by oppressing us. So the system of government they handed to us as independence was one of dictatorship. And we have mastered it well. We have mastered it well, and we have oppressed each other. And now we need to let go of that. And I think the question here, but maybe after the break, that's where we're going. My question is, where is the hope? Because we're talking about everything that doesn't work. We're talking about how we hurt each other. We're talking about all of those things. Where is the hope? Because if we have no hope, we cannot build. Where is the goodness? Because even in here, when there's xenophobic attacks, there are South Africans who love their fellow Africans. There are fellow Africans who love fellow South Africans. Where are we also seeing and amplifying those things that are good and that we can build on? That is the question. And sorry, I was feeling so much, I needed to say all of this.
Our African brothers, Comrade Design, thanks so much. I know you sent a late invite, but we appreciate these spaces whereby we need to come together, continuously talk about who we are, what are our challenges that we are faced with. I think the panel has already said, I appreciated Comrades Liwe in Doyoba. I think we must continue with the political education, comrade, asking the simple questions as to what the issues that we are facing as the African populace, as the poor and the working class, and who are our enemies. And you touched on that. Who are our enemies? You touched on that. And it's so strange that I received this invite. I was preparing for a discussion also around this. What are our strategies? Who are our enemies? It's going to be a webinar around this issue of Afrophobia, which is xenophobia, but pinning down to Afrophobia because it's targeting the poor and the working class, African poor and the working class. Why is this happening? To add on what you are saying, comrades Liwe and other comrades there. The white capital monopoly that is actually dominating the continent's rich resources. And our governments, political leaders who are in cahoots with these white monopoly capitals. Why are we getting my mother, my brother, my sister from the continent selling sweets in the corner, selling vegetables in the streets of Pukuletu? It's because they are displaced by the extractive economy. These white capitalists, they push and pull factors that we were talking about. And now what I want to appeal on the strategies, because we have to actually have strategies, Tina, inside this country and in the continent, and also start to lobby those who are still remaining in our own country, that we must lobby against the existence of white South Africa's businesses that are dominating the continent, that have actually displaced these women which we see in the streets selling vegetables, selling everything that for them to survive. They are being pushed by the supermarkets or ShopRite that are dominating the countries. In Ghana, you no longer, in markets that were actually are owned by the people of the country, but the domination, the vivid exposition of these as malls, ShopRite, supermarket. We must target in networks that we belong in, we must actually spread the gospel truth that we need to say, not only government, but us activists, to say we must boycott this as a response to the xenophobic, Afrophobic tendencies, because the government of South Africa is quiet. It has been quiet, and this is not the first time that this is happening. People have been maimed, killed. I just remember Unyati, who was maimed in Soweto in front of his children. So let's also strategize, my comrade. Thank you.